Good day, students. Dr. Lee Jones here with you. This is our discussion of Chapter 5. We'll call this Part 1, where we'll talk about liberalism. Earlier, we said our epistemological empiricism depends on our ability to merge that empiricism, or to merge our observation of phenomena with our normative assessment. The effort to do this thing is called variously in Chapter 5, the work of ideology or the work of applied theory. The goal here is to look at how things work and then to offer prescriptions that have practical relevance to political decision makers. In this recording, we'll compare classical liberalism to modern liberalism. Let's define our terms. What is a political ideology? At the heart of it, a political ideology is a consistent set of assumptions about the proper relationship between the citizenry and the state. Remember, the key words here are: one, a consistent set of assumptions. And then the second key phrase there is about the proper relationship. By way of proper, we're talking about making a value judgment about the heart of the relationship between the people and their government. And so that's why we're calling this a normative relationship. A political ideology then is a value or a belief system. Remember, it's rooted in a sense of normative assessments, a value or belief system that is accepted as fact, or is accepted as truth by a group of people. And this belief system is going to define the proper relationship between the government and society, between the governed and the governors. Remember, we're saying here that this is accepted as fact. It does not necessarily mean it is a fact. We're talking about consistent sets of assumptions. It is very clear that people, communities, countries, governments can come up with inconsistent sets of assumptions, right? Remember the philosophy of the Nazi Party, the Third Reich, Hitler. They had a set of assumptions, but it was inconsistent with the nature of reality. It was Aryan supremacy was accepted as fact and truth. However, the notion of Aryan supremacy was completely fallacious because they proceeded to lose World War II. So a political ideology then is a pragmatic application of normative theories. That's why in the textbook, every now and then you'll see the phrase applied theory, a pragmatic, a real world application of normative theories. In the best case scenario, a political ideology wants to learn the lessons from political theory and apply those lessons to current political relationships. Let's pay attention to the suffix at work here. An ism implies an action, a practice, or a process is at work. Liberalism then is a distinct doctrine or a set of principles that both explain and then forecast political behavior. So now for our recording, our predicate supposition is that liberalism has two forms. The theoretical roots of liberalism can be found in the 17th century writings of John Locke, the British political philosopher. And then they can also be found in the 18th century work of Adam Smith, famously The Wealth of Nations. All right. These early liberals, we're going to call them classical liberals. In the 19th century, liberalism was modified by the work of theorists such as T.H. Green and the social worker / sociologist Jane Addams. And so we'll call this later form of liberalism, we'll term this modern liberalism. Both classical and modern liberalism are concerned with limited government. They're both concerned with how limited government emerges from the understanding of natural rights and how economic development, or capitalism to be blunt, how economic development is an offshoot of the requirements of limited government by people who are born with natural rights. Both classical and modern liberals define what it means to be human. They're both attempting to cope with the ramification of the conclusions once they define what it means to be human. And then both classical and modern liberals are looking at the basic human rights of life, liberty, and property, defining them as being of natural origin. Remember, it is John Locke in his 1691 famous book, the second treatise or two treatises on government, where he says a state of perfect freedom to order their actions as they think fit without asking leave or depending on the will of another man. This is the nature of liberty or the nature of freedom for John Locke. So the effort here to study the effort to study the state of nature is in fact the effort to study human nature in its pure and in its most natural form, in its pure and natural form. The definition of a state of nature is fundamental to the understanding of both classical and I think modern liberalism as well. Let's go to your textbook and let's be clear. Let's read the book and be clear about the definition of Locke's state of nature. Here we're on page 99. This is the third paragraph. Your book says Locke begins his liberal theory by examining human nature. He writes of human nature in reference to what he calls a state of nature. The state of nature was a period of time prior to the creation of government. It was a time in human history where women and men lived in small groups and communities. And for Locke, it was very revealing. Why, Locke? What was so important about the state of nature? Locke says individuals living in the state of nature had not been influenced or shaped by laws or political decrees because governments did not yet exist. Consequently, Locke contends we can look to individuals living in this state of nature to see, this natural state rather, to see what humans are like at their most natural level. We can look into the state of nature to observe human nature itself. What we see your textbook saying about Locke, or what we can see from Locke, is that life in a state of nature is life before government, a time period of unrestricted freedoms where human beings are naturally in a state of, naturally in a state of freedom. So where human beings then are characterized in the state of nature, or in their most pure natural form without the interventions of governmental laws to restrict and control them, then human nature is one characterized by freedom, supposedly reason, and hopefully by some variant of equality. For Locke then, classical liberalism begins from the supposition that everyone has an equal claim to life and liberty and property, where everyone should have the ability to enjoy these rights freely. Now, please note the emphasis on life, liberty, and property. This, for the classic liberal, are called natural rights. Remember that Locke is writing in 1690. And by 1776, these natural rights find their way into the most famous sentence in one of the most famous documents of American history, culture, and doctrine. 1776, the Declaration of Independence is primarily penned by Thomas Jefferson. And the Declaration of Independence here says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And amongst these are what, Jefferson? Amongst these are life, liberty, and Jefferson says the pursuit of happiness. What are they according to Locke? Locke says these inalienable rights are life, liberty, and property. The Declaration of Independence then goes on to say that governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That then means that government is limited. So what we're saying is that people have natural rights, life, liberty, the right to hold property. Well, if people have natural rights, then they also have natural reason. Natural reason means that the individual is a rational actor and is capable of making his or her own decisions. Therefore, humans possess a natural capacity to reason, right? Remember, the natural rights are those that you're born with. Where do you get the things that you're born with? You get them from God. And the notion here is that if God gives you something, he's also going to give you the ability to know what to do with the thing that he gives you. So natural rights bespeaks a natural reason. Now, because people have the natural ability to reason, the classical liberal accepts then that they will develop a set of codes or ethical laws to live by. And these codes or laws, these will be called the laws of nature. These laws of nature are a set of commonsensical codes or things that are obviously correct to anyone that has the ability to reason, right? Any thinking person with common sense can deduce what these laws are. They just make good and plain sense. Now, this is a key point. Remember that if people have natural rights and they thus have a natural reason and will rationally produce laws of nature, then that means that people don't need the government to tell them what to do. The classical liberal then fundamentally presupposes that people can make up their own mind through their own rationality and common sense. It's not the government that makes people rational. People have a natural ability towards rationality, and they have this because of their birthright or their relationship with God. Therefore, if people don't need the government to tell them what to do, then government should accept that it should be limited. On this point, let's retire to your book, to your textbook. We're on page 101. I'm looking at the second paragraph where your text says that governments are formed because rational people see that they are useful. In the state of nature, certain annoyances may arise. Individuals pursuing their own preservation and betterment, consistent with that first law of nature, may act in self-serving ways at times. In disputes, individuals may be biased in favor of their own positions. These biases may make it difficult to resolve disputes in an impartial manner that is fair to all parties. So let's skip down, read the rest of this, but skip down. The desire for such a convenient arrangement, this is the motivating force for creating government. Government can do the job of legislating, adjudicating, and enforcing rules in conformity with the laws of nature. Government does not make people rational, but the government has a role to play in securing the natural rights that people are engaged in manifesting on their own. So let's press that point one more time. Why does government exist when people are rational enough to make their own decisions? Like if you've got natural rights and natural reason and can come up with the laws of nature on your own, what do you need the government for? Well, the classical liberal has an answer, right? The government is there to legislate, is there to enforce the law. And this is so that the people do not have to do it themselves. If people enforce the law themselves, it may be a backslide into a sense of barbarism that Thomas Hobbes spoke about in the Leviathan. So people consent to government so that the government will then protect their rights. Or in the words of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his text, The Social Contract, people will sacrifice some of their rights and give those sacrificed rights to the government. The government then collects those rights from the people and uses them to protect the rights that the people are not willing to give up. Citizens then give the government not power, but limited power. So natural rights and natural reason is then protected by an institution that is charged with the responsibility to make and enforce the law with the ultimate goal of protecting life and liberty and property. Excuse me, this is the end goal of government. If the government then, now we're retiring again to our Rousseau social contract theory, if the government then begins to abuse these rights, it has violated this social contract, and that government has lost the right to exist. That government then is to be overthrown. The people have a responsibility to their natural rights to overthrow that government and institute a new government that is respectful of the rights of the citizen. So classical liberalism and its concomitant theory of social contract theory also then has as an out clause, or has as the ultimate recourse of a people who's had their trust violated by the government, that's called a revolution. That's called a revolution. So let's make it plain. Let's identify the key elements of classical liberalism. Number one, the individual is more important than the state, more important than the government. Individualism. Number two, individuals are capable of self-determination and independence. Third, the classical liberal believes that human progress is possible because change is the rational effort to reform and improve the society that human beings have created. Fourth, there is a role for the government, but the government should be limited. The state exists merely to enforce the law, not to make men moral. The state then should protect people's rights. The state should not tell people how to live, so says John Stuart Mill. And so if people have natural rights that bespeak law, natural reason, that also then develops, the laws of nature, and the government is limited, then what of their economic relations? Limited government has an economic child, or let's say an output of economics, and that is called capitalism. That is called capitalism. Capitalism is the economic order that comes from limited government. On this point, once again, let us consult your textbook, page 102. I'm reading to you. Indeed, in Smith's theory, liberalism and capitalism are what? Mutually reinforcing social arrangements. Liberalism and capitalism share a conceptual basis. Both are founded on the premise of individual rationality. According to Smith, individuals pursue rational self-interest, right? And so, that's right. So individuals will seek to satisfy their interests and needs by exchanging objects. Your textbook examples: money, goods, and services. And each party to the exchange will seek to better their position. So capitalism, an economic arrangement in which individuals exchange their private properties according to their own self-interest with little or no state interference. Capitalism is thus justified by Smith. Capitalism then is the preferred economic relationship under a condition where the people are living with limited government. So the liberty and private property, they are mutually reinforcing social relationships. They are intimately related to one another. Individual liberty allows one to live one's life as one sees fit. This includes employing one's labor power, hopefully the effort to generate capital, and hopefully further still, the effort to accumulate profit. So liberty and property are equal. All rights are forms of property, and property itself is a form of freedom. The classical liberal then, right? The classical liberal holds then that the market system is based on property, a market system based on property, is itself a form of freedom. A person, therefore, is free when that person can sell their labor power, save their income, invest their savings, obtain capital, and then hopefully run a business for themselves. If the government, if any form of government gets in the way of challenging these liberties, then that government is obstructing liberty, and then that government should be threatened by the people. On this point, let me show you something. This is outside your textbook, but this is a good book. This book here, 1948, this is The American Political Tradition, written by Richard Hofstadter. In Hofstadter's book, let's turn our attention to the first sentence of chapter 1. The first sentence of chapter 1, where Hofstadter 1948 says, long ago it was observed that the Constitution of the United States is based on the philosophy of Hobbes and the religion of Calvin. The philosophy of Hobbes. Hobbes, again, is one of those early Enlightenment philosophers. And Hobbes, we see Hobbes in the Leviathan. He talks about the social contract. He talks about men being essentially barbarous because each person will be free to use their individual freedoms. Everyone is born with natural rights. Those natural rights includes the effort to obtain private property. In the effort to obtain private property, individually free human beings will come into conflict with each other. For Thomas Hobbes, the nature of that conflict in a state of nature where there's no government, so the type of conflict that people will have is hard, it's conflict, it's rough. Hobbes famously says life in a state of nature is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. So people are essentially competitive individuals that will resort to barbarism and brutality in the effort to obtain things with each other. The effort to civilize society then means that you need to have limited government. So this is what Hofstadter here is saying, that the Constitution is based on the philosophy of Hobbes and the religion of Calvin. It assumes that the natural state of mankind is a state of war, and the carnal mind is at enmity with God. So the Constitution is based on a sense of competitive individualism. Now let's move from the very first two sentences in Hofstadter's book, and let's turn our attention to this key paragraph on page 14. Let's read it together. Hofstadter says, what encouraged here he's talking about the founding fathers, about their own era, however, was the broad dispersion of landed property. The small landowning farmers had been troublesome in recent years, but there was a general conviction that under a properly made constitution, a modus vivendi could be worked out with them. The possession of moderate plots of property presumably gave them a sufficient stake in society to be safe and responsible citizens under the restraints of a balanced government. So influence in government would be proportionate to the property that people held. Merchants and great holders would be dominant, but small property owners would have an independent and a far from negligible voice. Let's continue. It was politic as well as just, said James Madison, where James Madison is understood as the father of the U.S. Constitution before he becomes the fourth president of the United States. It was politic as well as just, said Madison, that the interests and rights of every class should be duly represented and understood in the public councils. And John Adams, your second president, declared that there could be no free government without a democratic branch of the Constitution. I offer that to you to say that private property and the law are so intrinsically linked for the early or the classical liberals that the very notion of who the government serves is in itself founded in the amount of property that people hold. So private property then is essential to protect liberty. Free markets that are based on private property, it disperses power, and this protects subjects from state encroachments on their liberty. This is what the classical liberal believes. Friedrich August von Hayek, the Austrian economist, he once said, there can be no freedom of press if the instruments of printing are under government control. No freedom of assembly if the needed rooms are so controlled. No freedom of movement if the means of transport are a government monopoly. So private property then is essential to protect liberty. Economic liberty, rather economic inequality, is a natural byproduct of capitalist development. So let's see how the classical liberal talks about it. Economic inequality is a result of free choices that are made by rational individuals. Let us again retire to your book on this point. At the bottom of page 102, your book says, under classical liberalism, natural equality does not lead to economic equality. Although Locke and Smith proclaims that individuals are naturally equal, that is, when individuals are born, no one has a natural or preordained political authority over any other person. This is, of course, neglecting a conversation about the slave trade. Your book says they conclude that individuals living in society will come to be divided into different economic groups. Locke asserts that that economic classes of rich and poor will emerge as an economy develops. Locke attributes this class division to the use of money. He outlines his argument by explaining that in the early stages of economic development in any country, individuals tend to barter and exchange perishable objects. One person trades apples for beans. Because these objects of exchange are perishable, hoarding them for the purpose of stockpiling large quantities is very difficult. With economic development, however, societies begin to use money as a medium of exchange. Money does not spoil. Money can be hoarded. Some individuals can be expected to take advantage of the imperishable quality of money and start to store up increasingly large amounts. In this way, class development happens. In this way, classes of rich and poor begin to appear. So, economic inequality is a result of free choices made by rational individuals. Individual freedom cannot be violated for the sake of economic inequality. So the state should not intrude into the market. The state should not mandate outcomes like prices and wages. But isn't there something wrong with this notion? What about the normative assessment on the capitalist development of the state? Is it moral? Is it ethical to be fine with the nature of inequality? That leaves space for the modern liberal to get into the conversation. If liberty is freedom from state intervention, then this view of freedom is too narrow. Enter into the discussion the British idealist, the English, let's say the English economist and radical T.H. Green. T.H. Green is able to see the flaw in classical liberalism, the flaw meaning the acceptance or the allowance of wide-ranging economic inequality. Liberty should be the freedom to maximize human potential and to make creative contributions to society, instead of liberty merely meaning the freedom to hoard and allow classes to develop. If individual liberty is the freedom to live fully, then the goal is to be active. The goal is to have choice and use your potential to make society better. Once again, I hope you see me doing this on purpose. Once again, let's retire to your textbook. All right? Let's look at this argument from your book, and I enjoy this, and we're going to read the whole thing. Consider the ramifications of this revised definition of freedom. Think about a hypothetical person. Let's call her Mary Smith. Let's say she is unemployed and living in a homeless shelter. She is free to make personal choices in terms of where to look for a job, what kind of job to seek out, how many hours to spend at the shelter or looking for employment. Of course, she is also free to make choices on private matters of conscience, whether to believe in God or not, whether to support capital punishment and not, and so on. Despite her freedom of thought and opinion, however, let's say she is demoralized by her poverty and she feels defeated and hopeless. Here is the existential, economic, and political question. Is Mary Smith free? From a classical liberal standpoint, because she is not having choices dictated by an intrusive government and is not being interfered with, she is free. She is not happy, but she is free. And classical liberals would expect her to use her rationality to find a path out of this desperate, unhappy existence. However, T.H. Green's perspective is that no, Mary Smith is not free. Her potential to participate as a contributing member of society, it is being wasted. How very different her life appears depending on how one defines liberty. If one moves from a classical liberal definition to a modern one, the hypothetical person Mary Smith is transformed from being a free person to being a unfree or being an oppressed person. So let's think about it this way. Our mantra for this class is that politics is about power, and power is the effort to influence choice. If you do not have choices, then you do not have power. And if you don't have power, then there is no freedom, right? So the effort then of the modern liberal is the effort to expand choice. And how do you expand choice given the natural development of society into capitalism, according to the classical liberal? Well, then the modern liberal says you need an interventionist government. You need the government to get involved, to do something, to make sure that to make manifest expansive liberty. Let's define our terms. Interventionist government is one where the government takes a role in regulating some form of the economy, some form of the social and behavioral interactions between free individuals. Interventionist government. Expansive liberty is defined as positive liberty, where one is free from compulsion, where one critically is able to reflect on one's ideals and acts based on self-interest. Expansive liberty is where a person lives in an environment with the resources necessary to exercise the will to contribute to society. So an interventionist government is necessary to manifest expansive liberty. That means then that the state should not be limited only to the protection of individual liberty, but the state should intervene in society to help those whose positive liberty has been violated. Examples of this are, in the United States example, unemployment assistance, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, food stamps, those types of things. Remember the words of your James Brown. James Brown said, I don't need, let's say it the way he said, I don't need nobody to give me nothing. He said, open up the door and I'll get it myself. Okay, so let's move towards a bit of conclusion here. So the core beliefs of the modern liberal are thus: the state can and should promote expansive liberty to prevent exploitation, right? The modern liberal then believes that the interventionist government must produce laws to regulate things like healthcare, education, and working conditions, the ultimate goal being to promote the well-being of those who are less powerful. The modern liberal believes that economic inequality is a fundamental problem for the society because poverty prevents a person from realizing their true potential to contribute to that society. The government then must intervene to create limits to poverty, natural equality, and economic equality are thus equally valued. Another core belief of the modern liberal is that the social welfare of society at large is key and important. The state has to intervene to help those who have really big needs. Individual freedom is so wonderful that the powerful should not have the ability, by virtue of their economic and hence political position, to take it away from those people who are weak. Now, let's end this discussion by making a comparison between classical liberalism and modern liberalism. The classical liberal disagrees with expansion of state power, right? The modern liberal also disagrees with the expansion of state power. But at the same time, where the classical liberal says liberty is created by a limited government, the modern liberal says liberty is, I wrote created there, but liberty is protected by an interventionist government. So where the classical liberal focuses on natural equality, the modern liberal focuses on economic equality. And by economic equality, we don't mean to say that everyone has equal stuff. But by economic equality, what we mean to say is that the interventionist government creates a floor through which it will not allow the poorest people to fall through. It creates a limit to the type of poverty existing in the state. The classical liberal is hostile to expansions of state power. So you'll remember our earlier discussion, chapter 4, about how the famous political thinkers, how they answer questions, right? Should the state promote equality? So the classical liberal says they're saying no to Plato, no to Hobbes, no to Machiavelli in terms of the government being so big that it limits people's fundamental freedoms, natural rights. However, the classical liberal is saying yes to folks like John Stuart Mill, right? James Madison and the like. The modern liberal, by way of comparison, says that the state should be strong enough to regulate economic equality, but the modern liberal also says no, like Plato says, people are born into various groups. The modern liberal says no to that. Hobbes says the government should be strong enough to civilize a group of barbarous, competitive individuals. And the modern liberal says no, the government should not, do that to people. Where Machiavelli says the government should use fear and oppression to help people be secure in their lives. The modern liberal, along with the classical liberal, says no, the government should not use fear and oppression to do that. Where John Stuart Mill then says that the government should be limited such that the government allows people to be free to maximize their human potential. That is where both the classical and the modern liberal agree. Let's end this discussion here. We'll pick it up in part 2.